We're very fortunate today to have a repeat visitor, somebody who has made many trips throughout Florida and who is coming back for one more trip. Our speaker today is Kathy Silvestri, who is a longtime Floridian and has traveled throughout the state. She works as a writer for the Gulfport Gabber. She has attended college at the University of Central Florida, the University of Tampa, and she decided to start her graduate studies at the University of South Florida St. Petersburg and work on a degree in the Florida Studies program. Kathy decided that she was going to take a trip throughout Florida that looks back in time at what happened more than 70 years ago. In the late 1930s, as America was struggling through the Great Depression, one of the programs that was put together by the New Deal agencies was a writers' project that allowed for writers to go throughout the United States and do research into different archives, to sort archives, and also to do different types of programs and travel guides. There was a guide that was published about 74 years ago called Florida, A Guide to the Southernmost State. And it was an early tour guide, long before TripAdvisor and all the online sources that we have today. Kathy decided to take her dog and take a little drive around the state of Florida. Last winter, we had her come and talk about her drive along US Highway 19. Today's program is going to focus on some other drives throughout Florida, including part of US Highway 98. Her research is continuing, and we look forward to a book at some point in the future. Without further ado, Kathy Silvestri.
Hi, can everybody hear me all right? Yes. All right, well, thank you for coming, and thanks for being here. As Jim mentioned, during the Great Depression, the federal government paid writers to create a series of guides as part of the Federal Writers Project. In every state, writers with no jobs and no declared prospects created driving tours of that state. The idea behind the guides was threefold. One, the government wanted to put people to work, even writers. Two, the guides would, in theory, get people to travel, at least locally. And three, and some would say most importantly, they captured a slice of life in pretty much every corner of the United States. Now today, the cool thing about the guides is that since they were written well before the advent of the interstate, they're a pretty thorough tour book of the back roads of every state. Go into a Barnes & Noble and take a look at their tour section, especially the Florida section, and you'll find guidebooks telling you how to travel Florida with your kids, your dog, even your iguana. You'll find regional guides to different parts of the state. You'll find things telling you how to kayak Northwest Florida. They'll even have a guide or two about what you'll see on the interstate, which, by the way, is nothing. You will see absolutely nothing on the interstate. If you want to see Florida and believe that we exist for any other reason other than for larger news agencies like the Huffington Post to poke at the weirdness of the state, you have to get off the interstate. What you will not find in that Barnes & Noble or on Amazon is any sort of comprehensive travel guide to the Sunshine State. You'll find Florida for lovers, for families, for gay people, for bikers, for hikers, for kayakers, but there is no simple, this is Florida for everyone guide. Which is why it was always so weird to me that no one ever updated the guide to the southernmost state or any of the other guides to our other states. These writers toured Florida in 1937. The Works Progress Administration published the guide in 1939, and the last edition I could find updated was updated in the late 1950s. So after I took almost every class that the Florida Studies program at USF would let me take, they said, look, you need to write a thesis or do something. You have to graduate. You can't just stay here indefinitely. And I thought, okay, cool. Well, I'm going to see what happened to all those old driving tours. And I went to my professor, Gary Mormino, and I said, hey, you know how everybody else is doing all this really important stuff like talking about the history of citrus in the middle of the state, or maybe looking at our drinking water supplies and what's going to happen to it in 20 years? Yeah, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take a month off, I'm going to drive around Florida, and I'm going to write about what I see. What is so cool about the Florida Studies program is Dr. Mormino not only said, okay, he said, you know what, I think I can find you some funding. So that's what I did, but before I could do that, I had to spend about 6 months trying to figure out what happened to the roads from the guides. You see, you can't just put down a road in Florida in 1937 and come back and expect it to be there. Florida is a state of construction, and anybody who's driven I-4 has seen this, but it also happens on our back roads. The roads shift every time we repave them, and what I found as I went through the guide that sometimes they were more than a half mile off from where the guide writers said they would be. Now remember, this was before GPS. The guide was constructed in a manner that they said, turn here and in 3.7 miles you will see this road. Well, sometimes that road now, maybe 4.2 miles, maybe 3.2 miles, they all move, and they don't even have the same numbers anymore, a lot of them. My partner Barry, he suffered through pretty much every step of this with me, and I think probably sometimes a little bit more than me. I have this shiny red road atlas. It's called the Florida Gazetteer. It's oversized. And I went through each of the guide's 22 routes and tried to figure out where the roads from the guide went on a modern day atlas. I lost a solid chunk of my life playing kind of a geographic connect the dots from city to city, trying to figure out the road numbers. It was beyond frustrating because the DOT does not have a great sense of history. I couldn't find an easy to access log of what this road was called in 1937 as opposed to what it might be called now. So my life became a series of emails to road historians, and yes, they do exist, and trying to ascertain how much of what Wikipedia said about the highways was actually true. I swore at the DOT a lot for a few months because I was really concerned that the guide writers had left this tremendous legacy and these great tours, and I wasn't going to be able to figure out where they were. This legacy of Florida couldn't get lost to shoddy bookkeeping. So I sat for a few months, like I said, hunched over my dining room table with Post-it notes and highlighters, trying to go through the Gazetteer and cursing at anonymous civil engineers. I couldn't find the right road, and I wonder now if Barry thought, well, I'm sure when she gets the routes worked out, she's going to calm down a little bit. He knows now that didn't really happen. But I think at that point, maybe the realization was starting to crystallize in his mind that I was getting a little crazy about this project. This, by the way, is what the book looks like now. It has completely fallen apart. It has notes in it, but every route is in there. I was able to find all of the 22 roads and retrace them. Now, Barry was so optimistic about this is that he kindly offered to drive me around the state for a month. So in September of 2011, we loaded up the dachshund, as I said, or as Jim said, my computer, clothes, and some food into a 21-foot road trek, and we started painstakingly crisscrossing the state. We followed the original routes that the guide writers did, but we did create our new tour because in 1937 there was no A1A. The guide writers took US 1. So why did I do this? I mean, if you're here, it might already be no shock to you that I really do love Florida. You kind of have to love the state to get a master's degree in it. But I think in part one of the reasons I wanted to retrace these tours is that for me, a road trip is how, when I was 7 years old, I fell in love with this state. It was July 1st, 1980 when we came into the state. And what I remember most about the drive is my grandfather was with us. And we turned off the beautiful tree-lined Interstate 10 onto US 301, and I watched his face just twist and pale as we passed these bleached wood cracker houses and dingy brown cedar sheds, and his tan forehead just furrowed, and his big gray bushy eyebrows just got closer and closer together until his eyes just pretty much disappeared. Now, houses perched on stilts along 301. They didn't have shutters or window coverings, but they did have some grime and spider webs. And underneath them and alongside them, there was a ragtag fleet of pickup trucks with rusted wheel wells, oxidized roofs, and Bondo fenders. And they shared weed patches with John boats. Boats were marginally better taken care of. And there were some trailers, some washing machines, dilapidated farm equipment, and kind of a mise-en-scene of auto parts that would just be brand new every time we passed a new piece of property. I didn't really get it, but I do remember my grandfather just kind of sucking in air and just getting so quiet that it got loud in the car. I can imagine that he must have been thinking that, you know, this is why I left Italy, that my family's going to move to a slum in the South. What are they doing? And at every intersection we crossed and we didn't turn off, he got grimmer and grimmer, and he would just widen his eyes and then close them and shake his head. Like he just didn't even want to think about what was going to happen. Florida, he must have thought, was just one cesspool of poverty at that time. What he was seeing was the interior reaches of the state as you see it along 301. The parts that the Convention and Visitors Bureau and Visit Florida don't photograph and put on postcards. I could tell he was upset, but I didn't understand it. Of course, I was a kid, and so far my greatest adventure in life was going to the Bronx Zoo and having a goat eat my coat. And we took a train into the city and I saw Peter Pan. So this, for me, was just one big adventure. My parents decided to leave Westchester County to move down here to Clearwater. And they knew the drive's end result, which was a small 2-bedroom just a couple miles off Clearwater Beach. But my grandfather, he had no clue. Now, eventually we did turn our 1976 cruise ship-sized Buick onto 75. And the landscape got noticeably tidier and steadily more sanitized, and he did start to relax. I had visited before, but I was very little. The home we were moving to was my other grandparents' vacation home. And this is really my first memory of Florida, because I remember coming across Tampa Bay on 275, turning into the Courtney Campbell, and I saw this aquamarine studded water. And my dad saw it too. I remember him telling me, look at that. Look at how clear that water is. It's not like Staten Island at all. Now, this is a man that would still make the sign of the cross every time we went past a Catholic church, but I had never heard this type of worship in his voice. Now, I nodded and I looked out the window, and I did. I felt something kind of new and kind of familiar at the same time. Later, I think I recognized this as kind of coming to where I needed to be. Clearly, I fell in love with the water that day, but as I got older, I felt the inexorable pull of the other parts of Florida too. I have grown hopelessly enchanted with those weathered corners, the things you see on 301, the bits that don't fit in with the Convention and Visitors Bureau image of the state. You can kind of think of these as our skeletons. The chambers and the tourism boards want very keenly to present a clean and fresh view of the state, of white beaches and sparkling waters, and that's okay. But in turn, we've convinced ourselves that we need to make sure that our guests never see this other side of the state, this chintzy, broken down, rusted out state. Thing is though, I love that Florida just as much as I love the one where the crabs scurry about the intertidal zone and I can skim my fingers just under the water and pull up a handful of sand dollars. My parents, of course, are New York natives, but they didn't behave as the typical carpetbaggers, which is what my grandfather later referred to everybody who showed up in Florida the day after we did. My parents were very clear. They did not travel 1,300 miles to turn a fast buck or recreate a slice of Little Italy or whatever county, Michigan. They moved here because of what Florida would offer them willingly, not what they could convince her to surrender. And I learned that from them. I'm not trying to claim Florida. I want to let the state claim me. I want to see what's out there. So 30 years later, I still travel around the state, more than 30 years now, looking for parts I might have missed before they disappear under the heavy blight of franchises, strip malls, and jet skis. Now, to retrace the paths of the guide riders, I explored Florida on roads that parallel the interstates, rattling along with the same excitement that I felt back in 1980 when I was just a kid. Clearly, Tampa Bay has changed. The beaches have changed, and I do fear that one day the strip malls might win. But I troll the back roads, and I am always in search of that secret schmaltzy backwoods experience where you can still find those rundown shacks, where people still have rusted out washing machines on their front porch. I still get that feeling when I come over the bridge, now it's the Howard Franklin, and I see Tampa Bay. I still get that feeling like I've come home. I don't know if Stetson Kennedy or Zora Neale Hurston felt that anticipation because they had a job to do as guide writers. And Depression-era Florida was not exactly one big spring break. I can also tell you that as much as you might like writing or traveling or going on road trips, the minute you do it for money, it changes the game. I went a little nuts with a deadline attached to things. And my goal was to write a master's thesis, and then later I was under contract to write a book. So I got a little obsessed. I think that's probably a good word. And during the Depression, it was for grocery money. These writers were doing it so they could eat. It wasn't just, I want to get my master's degree. These people were trying to put food on the table. On Zora's part 2, it was more than a little demeaning. Zora Neale Hurston was, by the time she went on relief to become part of the WPA, she had no small measure of respect as a writer in the northern states. She was very well known in Harlem and New York's literary circles, but by virtue of her skin color, she was passed over for an editor's position that most historians now agree, and people at the time seem to think she really deserved. That went to Stetson Kennedy, who some of you may know. He later championed civil rights. He joined the KKK undercover as a reporter and later exposed them. Now, he was great. She was great. There were many other writers who were crossing the state, and all their voices meld together in one book. There is no attribution where you can say, oh, Zora Neale Hurston wrote this, or Stetson Kennedy did this. It's an amalgam of their voices together. The Federal Writers Project in Florida didn't just include the tours, though. They, with other writers, went along and created narratives from everybody, from former slaves to people working in the fields. They wanted to create a history of folklife Florida. This is what most people know of with the Federal Writers Project. The tours are largely neglected when people write about the Federal Writers Project in Florida and in other places. So let's go back again to the 7-year-old me and fast forward 3.5 decades. I'm ready to go, driven berry crazy, figuring out the roads, sorted out which books to take, which to leave. We drove up to Hilton Head and borrowed the Road Trek camper from his parents. And 1 month and almost 5,000 miles later, and yes, you can put 5,000 miles on one car in 1 month in Florida and never cross the same road twice. I had to sit down and make some sort of sense about what I saw. Cows. The original guide, I have a copy here, you can look at it after if you wish, has an introduction at the start of each tour. These introductions would list some of the better-known cities that a motor tourist would traverse, as well as pertinent details, such as whether you could find adequate lodging, what the pavement conditions were like, and things like that. Also, cows. Florida was and remains a big cattle state, and apparently they were like squirrels along the roadway in the 1930s, if you listen to the guide. Watch for cattle along the highway is a not uncommon warning. Of the 22 driving tours, only 2 fail to warn motorists about the dangers of cows on the highway. Oddly enough, one of these 2 is a stretch of US 41 between Naples and Miami going through the Everglades. The guide writers mention cottonmouths and gators here, but not as a danger, more of something that you would want to take a picture of, because apparently cows were a bigger concern in Florida than snakes or alligators in the 30s. And the other road that does not mention cows as a precaution is going from Haines City to Moorhaven, and it travels something called the Lake Wales Ridge, which is an ancient beach that is now right in the middle of the state, one of the highest points. Either the cattle there knew enough not to cross the road, or they were too busy using the land for citrus, which is what we used to call and still do our citrus belt. Now, when people ask me, or they hear that I've done this, one of the very things that they ask me first is, what's your favorite tour? And to me, that's like asking me to pick a favorite cheese. It's like Sophie's Choice. I can't do it. I really do love all the roads, even the horrible stretch that goes through the suburbs of Orlando. But if I had to pick one to do over and over again, there is something about A1A that, simply put, just makes me happy. It isn't just the beaches, although they are spectacular. In the original guide, the writers wrote about US 1 because there was no A1A. They had peppered that first route, though, with countless side trips across to this beach or that beach. But there was no way to get north to south along those beaches. You had to keep going back to US 1 to do it. I chose A1A because it was more appealing than US 1. In parts, A1A runs right atop sand dunes and fronts the cobalt blue of the Atlantic. And we're going to forget about the environmental horrors of putting a road on top of a bunch of sand dunes, because yeah, it's a bad idea, but you have to drive it. It's really amazing. In other parts, the road runs through just this horrible glut of t-shirt shops and low-rent tourist traps. But every inch of this road speaks to a different part of Florida. And believe it or not, those awful pockets with the tourist traps, they're the minority. A1A is, if you will, kind of a compendium of the entire state, even though it didn't exist when the WPA writers toured it. They went down US 1. Now, at the eastern edge of the mainland, US 1 takes travelers from the very northern south, and that's south with a capital S, which still has some antebellum feels to it. It also draws on its ocean for some history and its livelihood, goes down through the state on the east side and ends up in the glitz of Miami. Now, along the way, you will find some tolerable stretches on US 1, and certainly the path has historical significance. Unfortunately, the road has eased into a very unhappy amalgam of big box stores, ubiquitous franchises, and homogenized drive-through eateries. It has morphed from what the guide writers called a low-lying road showcasing tidal pools and the splendor in the sand to a haven for homogenization, symbolized most greatly by the repeated and persistent presence of franchise restaurants and Dollar General stores. Now, today, A1A connects what the guide writers called low-lying islands, and even though they're not low-lying in some cases anymore, they all have names like Fernandina Beach, Daytona Beach, and even the much celebrated and often dreaded Miami Beach, South Beach. Bridges and no small amount of dredging have made traveling A1A stem to stern a practical reality, and with a few relationship testing exceptions where perhaps the street signs could be clearer and perhaps the person navigating could have paid closer attention to them. Now, the original guide writers had no road like that to tempt them towards the sand. I like to believe that if they were alive today and they had a choice between what's left of US 1 and A1A, they certainly would have chosen to drive A1A from Fernandina Beach down to South Beach. Now, some things do remain unchanged on US 1, and it does still bring you into Florida by crossing the St. Mary's River. This is where we start our journey, at the top. Picture the first of 22 tours of an unknown state. The guide did come before the whole of the country dreamed of owning a piece of the Florida dream. Only later did the Sunshine State hold what historian Gary Mormino calls the promise of dignified endings and new beginnings. Now, here you are at the top of the state. Consider US 1 as we see it today, which is that. Two-lane bridges spanning the tea-colored St. Mary's River as you leave Georgia for a state that still looks a whole lot like Georgia up here. This is not what we expect of Florida today. It is not what the hotel brochures promise us. You can't see a sandy beach anywhere, and even the river appears dirty, as many people say when they look into it. It's a black water river. It's not dirty. What it is tannins, which is kind of just a fancy name for what you get when leaves and twigs decay in the water. It turns them a tea color. They're not toxins, but they do stain the river kind of a dahlia color, very between tea and black is a good description. The St. John River Water Management District is the agency that's charged with managing the river, and it claims the river has excellent water quality. It contains what they call very little suspended sediment. Because of its extensive bottomland swamps and marshes and a lack of development, it still has really good water quality. Remember too, though, that the 1930s traveler might not have felt disappointment at not seeing beaches here. Even now, the wilder parts of Florida can be downright daunting, even to me. 8 decades ago, I probably would have felt something akin to naked fear when I crossed over this bridge. The side trips to the beach on A1A likely promised the traveler relief from mosquito colonies living in the swampy woods. Of course, along the way, the travelers would have to watch for cattle. That's A1A, and it runs, as I said, north to south along the eastern edge. but US 98 traces the contours of the Panhandle's coastline right along the southern edge. The old tour ran from Tallahassee to Pensacola. That's actually 2 roads today. It's 319 south from Tallahassee and US 98 west from where 319 meets in the Crawfordville area. Now, there are 2 things you should accept without question about the coastal route of Florida's Panhandle. 1, it is wholly and completely possible to eat your way across the Panhandle. I know because I did this twice. From end to end, snacking and feasting from Wakulla to Pensacola Beach does not take that much money or really that much effort. It was very easy to find food. Both times we did this route, what happened was everywhere else we went in Florida, we went looking for food just as good as what we had here. There is a book waiting to be written about eating your way across Florida, but until that happens, know this: if you love seafood, go to the Panhandle. The second thing about US 98 is that the ephemeral, picture-perfect postcard image of Florida seems to really exist here. It's like an artist stepped in and painted these vintage beach towns that exist only in our imagination. This is where you will find the Florida of the postcards. The coastal stretch of road between Wakulla and Pensacola Beach evokes images of a pretend Florida, of the Florida we all want to believe in, even as we drive down US 19 to get to other places. These slices of Florida are broken up only by gritty vignettes of another Florida, the working waterfronts that bring us so much seafood. So we start eating our way west in Crawfordville. This is Oots 2. This was our first stop. Has anybody ever been here? No. Okay. I learned about this when I was in the Florida Studies program. We did a road trip, and this was one of our stops. My classmate Teresa came from this area, and although the entire class was in a van, neither of us really liked people enough to spend a weekend in the van, so we took my car separately and went on ahead. We stopped at this state park called Natural Bridge Battlefield, and just before sunset, she swore to the class, look, I know a shortcut that's gonna get us out to Oots. It's this great oyster place. So the class decided that we could, in my Volkswagen Rabbit, lead the way down a road that quickly turned to dirt, gravel, and pine trees. That's when Teresa turned to me and said, you know, I'm not 100% certain this road's gonna get us there, but don't worry, it should. It is a measure of my willingness to explore, or perhaps my stupidity, that at that point, I didn't even turn the car around. I went, all right. Now, I have this little red Volkswagen Rabbit, and I took it over the ungraded road, which was probably a pretty bad idea. Backwoods roads in the Florida Panhandle are not made for subcompact German vehicles. They're not even really made for Buicks. They're designed for trucks. Additionally, there was nothing but dark stands of trees on either side of what I guess you'd call a road, and it was looking increasingly ominous in the daylight that was quickly fading. So I placed my faith in Teresa until I saw a clearing just ahead. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there were these 2 beautiful cream-colored leather couches on which sat a group of men drinking canned domestic beers around a fire. Here's where it gets weird. There was not another vehicle in sight. There were no trucks. We didn't see a shed. We didn't see a house. It was just a bunch of guys drinking beer on couches in the woods. It was like stumbling onto some kind of Deliverance meets Brigadoon oasis. It was surreal. The forest appeared to have one way in and one way out, which was the way we had come. And there was no sign, I mean none whatsoever, that these guys could have made it to the middle of a damn forest with couches on their backs. I'm not making fun of them. I just didn't want to meet them in a candy apple red Volkswagen Rabbit with the dachshund flaxseed crackers and bad cell phone reception. I didn't know. Now, fortunately, the road opened up about a mile later, and just before us, we found Oots 2. And until right now, no one had realized that that's what Teresa did. I forgive her for leading me kind of blind through the woods, because for these oysters, you should be willing to risk death and humiliation. Now, forget about the health department, okay, and forget about what you might read on TripAdvisor. Forget about getting oysters Rockefeller. This place made me want to move to the Panhandle, even though there's no real job opportunities for a writer, beaches right here, or anything aside from these oysters. It is what you would call a classic roadside dive, and I could not love it more. The oysters taste like the brine of the Gulf, and the staff, they wouldn't have worried about those guys on the leather couches, I promise you. It's owned by a woman called Miss Dorothy, and Miss Dorothy used to groom dogs until one day the owners of Utsu decided they were going to close, and she decided she was going to buy the place. She didn't change anything at their owner's request, but also why would you when it was working so well? She's held on to a piece of local legend, and she did keep the land out of developers' hands, which was everybody's concern. It's not pretty, it's not fancy. It has very, very local oysters and plenty of them. She takes them and she has a big styrofoam cooler and she shucks them to order, and the boats bring them in off the St. Mark's. Right there, they are alive this morning seafood. In the Panhandle, the idea of locavorism takes on a different meaning. Here, when I walk into a restaurant, and I'll use the example of a restaurant called PJ's on St. Pete Beach because they serve a lot of seafood and get a lot of my money. And I will say, what's local? And the server might say, well, the Gulf grouper is, of course, from the Gulf of Mexico, and we have our oysters from Apalachicola today, and the shrimp is from Key West. So that's local. Now, long before locavorism entered our lexicon, the people in the Panhandle ate what they caught. And while we're talking about food miles and our food's carbon footprint, here's how an eating local discussion went for us in Port St. Joe, which is one of those small overlooked Panhandle towns. We walked into a place called Triple Tails, which is a seafood market on US 98, and we found rows of plastic tubs packed with ice in Ziploc bags of fish. So there's a kid behind the bins, and we say, well, what do you have that's local? And he thinks for a minute, and he shakes his head, he goes, you know, not much. And I, of course, am very disappointed until he starts talking again, and he says, see, the scallops are from Panacea, and the shrimp came from Apalachicola, and the snapper was caught in Panama City. Panacea is less than 2 hours away by car. Apalachicola is less than 30 minutes away, as is Panama City. Now, people in other parts of the country drive further than that to go to the grocery store. But back home here, local means the Gulf of Mexico, but clearly along the Panhandle, they take their fishing very seriously. Local a lot of times means what came off of the boats the market owns. So we got seafood there, and then we went to Apalachicola, because you have to taste the oysters again in Apalachicola. The phrase working waterfront is one we hear a lot about now, and it calls to mind Disney-esque images of these quaint, cranky, grizzled fishermen offloading their catches while they sing sea shanties and toss mullets from their boats to dock hands. In reality, a working waterfront really isn't that pretty. If you don't believe me, visit Apalachicola. The downtown itself has a certain ephemeral charm. It has antique shops with nautically themed old stuff. That's what the sign says. And it has historic markers on a lot of the buildings. But if you walk down to the waterfront, you'll see the reality of a working waterfront. And while it has a charm that I adore, it isn't really beautiful in the conventional sense. The nets are colorful, as are the fishermen, and the oysters are completely worth it. But the ideal working waterfront is kind of like the idea of a pastoral, the guy who has the dream of owning his own farm. Might be dreaming about a few cows waiting to be milked and ears of corn and beans growing in tidy rows, but he's not thinking about the fertilizer, the snakes, and the cow crop. So there's two sides. Now, Florida fishermen, the guide explains, come in two varieties, net fishermen and sportsmen. This is still mostly true, although the state banned net fishing for a lot of people in 1994. In this area of Florida, you'll find a third type of fisherman called a tonger. Tongers, or oystermen, use scissor-like tongs to bring the oysters to the surface. From there, they're sorted by size, because oysters have to be at least 3 inches long for tongers to harvest them, and then they're brought to the shore for sale. Now, for all the oyster activity, and this area provides 90% of Florida's oysters and 10% of the country's. Nearby East Point, also an oyster town, looks like a ghost fishing town. However, if you go beyond the docks and just beneath the boats, there is an oyster town very much at work. The Franklin County oyster industry accounts for 1,000 jobs and roughly $1 million of the local economy. East Point's docks run the entire length of the town's waterfront, and the fishing trips there, of course, include kayaking, sport fishing, but they also take people on oyster trips. On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig which was licensed to British Petroleum, exploded, killed 11 workers, and created a 5-mile-long oil slick in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Oil gushed into the Gulf at an estimated rate of 210,000 barrels a day, and while BP scrambled to control the oil, the Florida oyster and tourism industries held their breath, waiting to see how far into Florida the oil would seep. Now, although this disaster did not decimate North Florida's fisheries and oyster beds, BP nevertheless paid fishermen, tongers, and others potentially impacted by the spill across Florida. Some of the tongers who received money for damage that never occurred used it to take a year off from work, and they chose not to work the oyster beds. The restaurants and suppliers then had to look elsewhere for their oysters and in many instances raised prices. In fact, in the following season, raw oysters, oysters Rockefeller, any type of oysters that were served in Florida did have a price increase. Diners assumed this increase stemmed from the oil spill in the Gulf, and they had it half right. Florida oysters suffered no damage from the oil, but some tongers who were blinded by the payoffs took an extended holiday, and they didn't have enough people to work the oyster beds. Oysters were scarce, but they were fine. They just couldn't get anybody to harvest them. Now, we went to Boss Oyster, which is on the water in Apalachicola, and we ate oysters at an alarming rate. Manager there explained that the restaurant had its own boats certified by the Department of Agriculture for collection and selling. She also told us that the tongers who decided not to work hurt the Florida seafood industry so badly that when they wanted to come back for a job the next year when the payoff money ran out, nobody would hire them. Boss Oysters and many like them refused to rehire any tonger who took off 2010 because it impacted their livelihoods so severely. Now, like so many of the best places along US 98, Boss Oyster is not fancy. If you sit along the water, what you're going to see is shrimp and oyster boats, commercial fishing vessels, and in the distance, even more boats. Everything smells like fish and oysters and salt. Welcome to a working waterfront. Many Florida towns boast of sandy beaches and oyster bars, but very few can claim oyster boats. Only marginally fancier is Up the Creek Raw Bar, just up the road, where you can sip the not quite as local Pensacola Porter beer on their second-story screen dock, which is a nice break from the bugs, and it looks over Apalachicola Bay. Like I said, there's a shopping district, but really, food is the main attraction here. And I'm just hitting the high points of the food that we ate along the Panhandle. There was so much more that we did eat. The final of my 3 best experiences, though, would be the Floribama Bar on the Florida-Alabama state line. There is a whole culture surrounding this place, which is quite possibly the world's most glamorous dive bar. Every April, it hosts the Interstate Mullet Toss, where contestants toss mullet, the fish, not the hair, across the state line into Alabama. Now, it is actually 6 feet off the state line of Alabama, but they do cheat a little bit every April. In 2004, Hurricane Ivan swept massive amounts of sand and water into the bar, tore parts of it in two, and left everything in a state of near devastation. It didn't overcome that and finish rebuilding until about 2 years ago. The first time I went back in 2011, it still had blue tarps up, Tyvek that wasn't treated, painted, nothing. When we made it back this October, the bar had finally finished. That was 2004 to 2013 it took them to rebuild. It did stay open through most of that, though, and it served the 2 things that keeps people coming back. Something called Royal Reds and something called a bushwhacker. Royal red shrimp were relatively unknown until the late 1990s. The ones are about this big. They boil up bright red. That's how they get their name. And shrimpers cast nets roughly a half a mile down just off the continental shelf to bring them up from the other side. They only do this when they're having a hard time getting the pink shrimp that we're all familiar with. It's kind of a pain for the shrimpers, according to the ones I talked to. They don't like going to get them. They go for about $18 a pound in the restaurant, and they taste like little lobsters when they boil up. As a result of how they're fished and that they're not fished that often, the people who pay attention to these things refer to them as sustainable seafood. Now, a bushwhacker is a debilitating combination of milk, rum, amaretto, and ice, and they mix it up in huge machines there. It's not anything local, and it's certainly not anything necessarily special to the Floribama or even Florida. You can get this in other places. What I find so odd is how well it goes with the shrimp. Because really, historically, people eat shrimp and drink beer, but somehow it's like the rest of the panhandle. Things that don't go together, like shrimp and liqueur, or oysters and dog groomers, leather couches and rednecks, it works out. On a larger scale, I think that's how Florida works too. I saw this over and over again on every tour we traveled. Now, yeah. Who's seen one of these? Yeah, bird on a bicycle, that's Florida. Any of these tours in the book provide a wonderful stepping off point for people who want to travel. The town names remain the same, and this includes a town called Juliet, which the guide writers point out has 2 T's, is misspelled, and no, that was not intentional on the town's part. They just didn't know how to spell Juliet. Just down the road is Romeo, also another town. So much about Florida has changed in the just over quarter century since Stetson and Zora and the others toured the state. We have a very popular local writer who writes about what he calls real Florida, and I'm not disputing that anything he writes about is less than real, because it is quite real. I do, however, take issue with the idea that we have a fake Florida. I have poked around pretty much every corner of this state, spent a good deal of time and money doing so, and I can tell you without reservation, it's all real Florida. Not far off US 17, you can find the historic headwaters of the Everglades behind a gas station across the street from SeaWorld. That's real Florida. You go along US 41 in Gibsonton, not that far from downtown Tampa, and you're going to find a community that is comprised largely of retired circus acts. You're going to find fossilized shark's teeth along the Peace River in US 27, even though you're well inland. And at the eastern edge of State Road 50, you can visit a nude beach in view of the Space Center. We have mermaids, watermelon queens, and a town called Two Egg. We have strip malls, dinner and shows, and Mickey Mouse. And that's all real Florida. If we ignore that, we're ignoring our history, because Florida has always been different things to different people. And while the roads will change and the experiences you have along them will, that's not going to. It is no secret that we do things differently down here. We hear that a lot, right? That's not how we do it up north. And that is a very popular refrain when it comes to our bakeries, our pizzerias, and our grocery stores. Bagels are better in Manhattan. Hot dogs are better in Chicago. Brooklyn beats Florida hands down with pizza. Some people might try and tell you we have it wrong down here, because no matter what is, it's not how we do it up north. And I agree. Things in the Sunshine State are different. Every day I wake up in this amazing, messed up, hanging chad, environmentally compromised, criminally creative, backwards, wonderful state. I am relieved we don't have bagels the size of a dinner plate, and I love finding a pizza that's any good is only just a little bit harder than finding the Holy Grail. I am thrilled our cheesesteaks and hard rolls don't measure up, because that clears the way for things like Cuban sandwiches, which were invented in Tampa, by Tampa Cubans, by the way, Gulf oysters, Gulf shrimp, key lime pies, and sour orange pies. That's what we do down here. And that other stuff, that's not how we do it up here, down here. We can't claim Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, but we do have Ponce de Leon and his Fountain of Youth, and Jacques Lemoyne, who was one of the first French explorers on our coast. We don't have Paul Bunyan, but we have a man called Toch Brown, who was an Everglades pioneer and a folk hero. We don't have the Founding Fathers, but we do have something in the Florida Studies program we refer to as the Founding Mothers. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, Marjorie Carr, and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. There's no Mount Rushmore, Rockies, or the Appalachian Trail, but we have the Swanee River, the Florida Keys, and the Everglades. Look, I know there's a lot about Florida that's messed up. I'm not blind, I read the news. The state has problems that surpass mosquitoes, tiny bagels, and bad pizza. But we have an amazing patchwork of cultures, people, and history. When the original guide writers created these tours, they left us a legacy. They showed us that Florida truly is greater than the sum of any one of her parts. We're a big state, and we have a lot of different people here. We have the Deep South up in the Panhandle, where you will still find pre-Civil War construction that only exists because people were too poor to tear it down and rebuild, so they rehabbed it. It was cheaper. It has the Kennedy culture of Southeast Florida, and then in the middle you're going to find fish camps and cattle ranches and a few remaining citrus groves. The WPA gave Florida another gift too, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Young men found work building state parks. 8 of our state parks were built completely by the CCC, and most of these parks are well within striking distance of the tours from the guide. I've stayed at several. There is a great line from the Pixar movie Cars, where there's 2 cars sitting around talking. You don't get to say that much. And one small town car is telling a big city race car about how the roads worked before the interstate and what the country was like. And she's making the point that people used to drive the roads to have a good time, and they weren't that concerned with making good time. It has been 77 years since the guide writers toured those roads, 75 since the WPA published the Guide to the Southernmost State, and 58 years since we started building the interstate that would bypass these roads completely. If you follow even one of these tours, you are not going to make great time. They are slow going. I promise you, you will have a good time. You will see so much more than what's on the roadside. You're going to find a Florida you had no idea existed. Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes, sir.
In your tour of the Panhandle, do you recall a town called Seaside?
In my tour of the Panhandle, did I recall a town called Seaside? Absolutely I did. Seaside is kind of a curious town. There's a little road that bypasses US 98, 30A, and it runs even closer to the coast. The town this gentleman's referring to is called Seaside. It's I believe it's Santa Rosa County that it's part of, and it is a beautiful small town. The homes are all very strictly regulated. They're built very much the same. They have almost a Disney feel to them. If you saw The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, that was the town they used. Seaside was created as a resort town, which most people don't realize. But it's also involving something called new urbanism, the idea that we can have town centers and that everything you need you can walk to. Seaside did this very well. You can walk the entire town, and it's also a town that is very beautiful. It has been created by a developer who coincidentally had a dachshund and a cat, and you will see the logo of a dachshund and a cat. It only has, I think, 1 full-time resident. Most of the homes are vacation rentals, but it does have a school. It's absolutely beautiful. We stopped there. We did stop there, walked around, and their beaches are, I mean, all the beaches in the Panhandle are just sugar, powdery sand. They have done a very good job of working in tandem with the environment there, the way that they've kept the development off the beaches. There's another one next to it called Watercolor. 30A, that entire road is a gorgeous trip. It is, it goes through several state parks also. So, yes, sir?
After you finish your studies, where do you plan to live?
After I finish my studies, where do I plan to live?
Yes.
Oh, God. About 10 years ago, my mom and I were out shopping, and we were talking about Florida, and I went off some random tangent, and she just looked at me. She goes, "Are you just waiting for me to die to move down to the Keys?" I said, "Well, I wouldn't put it that way, no." I used to think I would move down to the Keys. I actually live in a town called Gulfport now at the southern edge of the county. And I have to tell you, I've lived in Clearwater, Orlando, Kissimmee, St. Petersburg, and I think Gulfport might be it for me. We're a very small town. It is a very interesting community. It's nice to be in a small town in Pinellas County. We're the most densely populated county in the state. We're also the 2nd smallest county in square miles, so that's a lot of people, but when you get into Gulfport, it does feel very different. I think I will do some traveling. I used to think the Keys, but the more I go down to the Keys, the more I keep watching things push south, and I think that it would just break my heart to live there. So, yes, ma'am.
Is your book coming out soon? Or?
Is my book coming out soon? I am under contract with the University Press of Florida for the book. It is currently going through edits, and the hope is, yes, that it will be out by Christmas, but I am being very careful not to promise that because a lot of things can happen, but yes.
Do you have a website?
I have several, do I have a website? I have several blogs. I have one, it was called findingmyflorida.com. Because of the contract of the book, they have asked me to stop publishing to it until the book is out. You can get to that by going to kathycelestri.com. It has 2 of the tours listed pre-edit. And there's also another blog that I keep with just random writings. It's called crabtrap.blogspot.com. Yes, sir. Are there any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. I'll be around if you want to talk to me afterwards. I really appreciate you being here.